Welcome to episode 256 of the Fabulously Keto Podcast. And today's guest is Dr. David Vis. I met David at the IFAC conference in London in September 2025, and his talk really stood out. It was one of those sessions that makes you stop, think, and see things differently, especially around food addiction, ultra-processed foods, and mental health. David is a nutritionist and researcher specializing in mental health, addiction, and recovery. His own personal journey led him into this work, and he now supports people with depression, anxiety, addiction, and disordered eating using functional medicine and a real food approach. Here's David's bio. David Vis, PhD, RDN, IFMCP. Dr. David Vis is a pioneering mental health nutritionist and Institute of Functional Medicine certified practitioner, IFMCP, who bridges nutritional science and psychiatric care through comprehensive root cause analysis. With over 13 years of clinical experience, he founded Nutrition in Recovery and the Wise Mind Nutrition app, transforming mental health treatment by integrating cutting-edge personalized nutrition protocols into substance use disorder and eating disorder care. As a researcher and a thought leader whose work has been cited in National Geographic's, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, Dr. Vis has authored over 20 peer-reviewed publications examining the complex relationships between ultra-processed food addiction, eating disorders, and mental health outcomes. His commitment stems from witnessing firsthand how medicinal plants can restore hope when traditional treatments fall short. Through his clinical work, research, and advocacy, he continues to pioneer whole person approaches while training the next generation of integrative mental health practitioners. So let's go and hear from David. Welcome, David, to the Fabulously Keto Podcast. It's fabulous to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to chat with you.
We met at the IFAC conference in September, and we're now recording in November, so this is going to be really good. It was a great speech, is it? It's not really a keynote speech that you did, so brilliant.
Yes, the Food Addiction Conference in London was fantastic this year.
It was very, it's the first one I've been to, and I don't really have that food addiction thing. I have more harmful user type tendencies. And I found it I wasn't going to go, but I found it really interesting. I'm really glad I went.
Yeah, it's great to be part of that network and many others and just see what people are cooking up in their own personal and professional lives.
Yeah. So we always start with, where in the world are you?
Great. I am in West Los Angeles, and I have been here my whole life since I was 1. And I currently live on the same street that I grew up on. So I am loyal to my soil. And I have an office walking distance from my home. So I've mastered the art of living in Los Angeles.
Fabulous. I love that. Yeah, I did move away for a while, but I don't live very far from where I grew up. So why don't we start with you telling the listeners how you came to incorporate nutrition into your profession and how you use it, and we'll go on to some brain health stuff.
Yeah. I think that most people in the nutrition field have a personal journey that informs their professional interests. And when I was 24, I got very serious about my health, and I started exercising really for the first time. And I had a rapid transformation within a few months that made it very obvious to me that there was something there that I needed to pay attention to. For me, obviously, I had some biological changes that were favorable, and I also had a marked reduction in my anxiety. And I knew that nutrition and movement and sunlight and sleep and water and supplements were all part of recovery. And it certainly was for me. And I just wanted to share that message with more folks. And it sort of happened organically people started asking me for advice and for help. And then I saw a well-lit career path.
Yeah. So did you have anything else other than anxiety that was bothering you at that time?
Yeah, I have a history of some substance use disorder, and I struggled in my early 20s. It was the first wave of the opioid crises in the United States, and there was just widely available substances, and many people in that age tend to party. I think that my genetic legacy of alcoholism, my predisposition on my mom's side, definitely got the best of me, and I knew that I wanted to live a different life. And so I got into some trouble and had a chance to hit a reset. And I thought about what were some major things that I could change, and nutrition and exercise were on the top of my list.
Yeah. And it's fabulous how it works, isn't it? So I guess had you been to college at that point, or were you going, or did you not
Yes,
bother?
I was in an undergraduate program at USC, and I was struggling. Shocker, right? I
Mm.
was switching majors, trying to figure out where I fit in, more invested in my social life, nightlife at the time. And I was really on the cusp of getting kicked out of school.
So was it the change that you made that made you decide to go into functional medicine, or had you already been thinking about that path anyway?
Funny story, when I was in undergrad and in my partying phase, I took a nutrition class and I actually dropped out because I couldn't hang. It was too much for me. This was during the time when they had those early calorie databases, and the assignment for the class, the major assignment was to get into a body composition analysis device. They had underwater measuring at the time before all of the bod pods and other related technology came out. The assignment was to track all your food and count calories and be very intentional about changing something. And it just wasn't at a time in my life when I was capable of that sort of change or even tracking. It just didn't work well with my lifestyle. I couldn't keep up and I dropped the class. So my early exposure to nutrition was, wow, this could be helpful for me. And I'm tapping out. I couldn't do it. So,
Probably
um,
just as well, really.
right.
So
And,
I
and
remember at the conference you said the diet industry loves the calorie in, calorie out model, and that's why I don't. So do you want to expand on that?
yeah, I do believe that there's been significant efforts to make nutrition into a hard science, which is favorable because when you do research, you need to control variables, and calories is a perfect example of something that should probably be controlled in a study. So there's been a lot of emphasis on nutrition being mathematical, which is a favorable thing for the field, so that it's more of a quantitative science. But in the context of mental health, not everyone's brain works fully quantitatively. Some people need a more gentle, what I call qualitative approach. And that's a tougher sell for people about food quality in terms of processing or the colors that are in food, the packaging, the internal cues of hunger and fullness. And so when I made my significant life changes, I didn't use a calorie model. I just ate real food and kind of did the opposite of what I used to do.
Yeah.
And that worked really well for me because there are people that have a tendency to be more rigid and have black and white thinking, pass, fail, etc. It's not to say that in my educational journey, I didn't ever engage with the calorie model. But in school, when I got a master's degree and became a nutritionist, I did learn that that was sort of the primary conceptual model. And I always knew that there was more to it. And then since that time, really studying the food industry and how food companies develop products and market them, they tend to use the calorie model as a way of, I think, confusing consumers. And again, it's not to say there isn't incredible value there. I just saw early on that there was more. And when the food industry came under fire for excessive additives, oils, sugars, salts, their response was always, well, we're here to help. So here's a low fat version with less calories, or here's a reduced sugar version that has artificial sweeteners. And they were able to really lean on the calorie model to respond to public health concerns about the food supply. And it did seem to me like, while that was potentially a step in the right direction, it didn't fully solve a lot of people's issues, because now people are eating ultra processed diet foods, right? Artificial sweeteners and powders and bars that have ingredients that don't readily occur in nature. And so I've always had a strong bias toward eating real food. And, a calorie-centric model will, look at avocados and walnuts as, high calorie foods. This was, the kind of stuff that I was noticing. I was like, this is wild. We need to think about things differently. So I've tried really hard to promote alternative frameworks to the calorie model, probably because I know that's what a lot of people need, and also partially because I'm not interested in doing that for my career.
Yeah.
I want to do something more meaningful. I want to talk to people and solve problems. And, early in my career as a nutritionist, I noticed that a lot of people sought out help and had a lot of assumptions about what the work was going to be. They believed, because that was the predominant model, that my job was to calculate a calorie range to give them a macro distribution and then show them how to do that. And I think it's safe to say that I played around with that model early in my career, but at some point it started to feel very shallow to me, and I wanted to do more meaningful work with folks.
Yeah. So how did you come to start helping people? I mean, you help a lot of people that have depression and other mental health disorders. How have you managed to get into that, and then tell the listeners how you're using that to alleviate some of the symptoms?
Yeah, I started with a lot of focus on nutrition for substance use disorder, because that was my own personal story that really had me passionate. And I was, running groups at addiction treatment centers and bringing nutrition education, and again, wanting it to be not predictable, right? So trying to think about topics that would really pique people's interest in some new ways. That orientation led me to a deep dive into the science of food addiction, what we now call ultra processed food addiction, or even ultra processed food use disorder. And I quickly got involved in eating disorder treatment and care. And so it's probably safe to say that the bulk of my career and my research has been on the intersection of substance use disorder, food addiction, and eating disorders, because those were the types of clients that were in the centers and that were actively seeking help. And I did a lot of individual counseling as well as scholarly efforts in that area. One of the things that became pretty obvious to me after a few years was that the research on nutrition for substance use disorder was very limited. I had published a few papers, but there wasn't funding necessarily for this type of work. Shocker.
Yeah, there's no money in that, David.
Yeah, exactly. And so I realized at some point that I wasn't going to just die on the hill of this is the way that I see the world, because this is what happened to me. And I did want to broaden from nutrition for addiction to functional medicine for mental health, which basically creates much wider nets. Functional medicine includes nutrition, but it also includes a lot of other lifestyle medicine approaches, as well as systems biology thinking, specialty lab testing to try to hone in on what we call the root cause, and that the evidence for other mental health conditions, specifically depression, was emerging. That there were groups, not necessarily in the US, but in UK and Australia and parts of Canada and South America that were really doing research on the role of micronutrients in depressive symptoms and anxiety as well. And so it became obvious to me that I did have to, one, follow the data, and two, think about ways that I could reach more people. Interestingly, trauma, anxiety, and depression tend to cluster and co-occur with addictions and disordered eating, quite predictably. So I saw a vision where instead of treating some of the downstream symptoms, the addictive tendencies, let's try to go upstream and treat the biological embedding of adversity, the depressive symptoms, and some of the stuff that might be contributing to the behavioral outcomes.
So do you think a lot of people that have addiction had traumatic events, maybe when they're children, or something that's happened in their life that has sort of pushed them in that direction?
There are scholars and experts who would argue that addiction doesn't exist without some underlying stress, trauma, and adversity. And I think it's probably a safe statement. I don't like to speak or think in absolutes, but the data that we have suggests that people that have multiple ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, or that come from a background of generational trauma, addictive disorders, are 4, 5, up to 10 times more likely to have an addictive disorder. It's a very clear link. And the original ACE study mapped out the odds ratios between ACEs and illicit substance use, injection drug use, etc. And I was savvy enough to know that people with substance use disorders tend to cross addict into other addictive disorders, right? And so if childhood adversity is a risk factor for substance use disorder, it has to be a risk factor for addiction like eating.
Yeah.
And so that's been a focus of some of my research, looking at childhood trauma and ultra processed food addiction. And I've collected data from my own private practice as well. Important note that ACEs and childhood trauma are not the identical thing. They tend to coexist, but there are scenarios where people have a lot of childhood adversity and don't have the same traumatic effects. It's less about the event and more about the meaning that's ascribed and the other complexities that occur across the lifespan.
Yeah, how they took that, how they created meaning from that, I guess.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So you've been involved with IFAC and getting through, trying to, correct me if I'm wrong, trying to get food addiction as a classification for disordered use. How did you get involved in that, and how is that going?
I think that my role in the collective food addiction community has always been to be a voice of reason and bring a eating disorder informed lens, which means that, there's a lot of folks in the mainstream eating disorder community that don't agree with the construct of food addiction. And I've worked really hard to bridge the gaps between the two fields and saying that, yes, this is true and this is true, and we need to look at this sort of gray area. So I think I was recruited to be a part of those efforts as someone that could make sure that the language we use around food addiction is informed by sensitive topics to the eating disorder community, things like dietary restriction, body image, internalized weight stigma, and a lot of those other factors. So I do believe that my first presentation for that group was on this topic. And I have been part of some committees to try to, really get some more recognition. It's been a long and slow process, which I expected. And the reason, I have a background in public health and I understand systems quite a bit. And I do recognize that a lot of folks want ultra processed food use disorder, you know, to be a legitimate diagnosis so that people can create treatment and get reimbursement, right?
Mm.
And, I do think that the, regulatory agencies see some of that conflict, which is like, oh, these are people that treat this and they want to make it legitimized. So there's that piece, but my public health background recognizes that getting this to be in the ICD or the DSM, which is what we have in the US, would stimulate more research and also would put pressure on food manufacturers to reformulate. And I've always seen that as the real value. As someone that's provided treatment for addiction like eating for many years, it has its challenges. And I do believe that, intervening on the food environment will be a very fruitful type of intervention. And fortunately, in the last year plus here in the US, there has been a lot of progress made in that area in terms of removing food dyes and getting food companies to reformulate. And a lot of the research on ultra processed foods, the NOVA classification, has really accelerated that effort. And it's exciting. But I did know, to answer your question, I did know that it wouldn't be an easy process where we're just going to get this in and now, the fingers are going to be pointed at the mega corporations, right? I knew that it would face pushback from big food, big pharma, and the established medical industrial complex, as we call it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you get lots of pushback because that's going to affect their bottom line, which nobody wants when
That's
they're
right.
trying to make more money for the shareholders.
And we don't have a lot of evidence-based treatments yet. And that's also worth recognizing that like the problem has been well described. We know that people have symptoms of addiction like eating, lots of studies, 1,000 plus. We know that ACEs are a risk factor. We know a lot, but yet we don't have large randomized controlled trials to show that this approach works better than this approach. And that's, I think, what people realize we need to work on. Right now, there are some efforts, particularly in the context of this idea that very deliberate dieting, for example, super low calorie or weighed and measured food plans, can have some negative consequences for people.
Yeah.
And so that's the major hurdle. There could be someone who goes keto, for example, for food addiction recovery, and their whole world opens up and they have no issues. And now they're in recovery and they can see the world clearly and their whole world makes sense. And there's also going to be people that fail and are rebound binge eating and all of that. So we need to parse out who's a good candidate for these type of nutrition approaches, including eating real food, low carb, ketogenic diet, classic weighed and measure food plans. There's a lot of different camps in the food addiction space. And I think that if we could do really good assessment on folks, we could figure out which one of those lanes would make the most sense for them.
Yeah. So when you're working with somebody, I mean, you not having this research to hand, what's your main approach? How do you approach it with people?
Yeah, I have to use a lot of intuition. In my private practice, I do collect data up front. Like I said, I was collecting ACE scores for many years and PTSD symptoms and anxiety and depression. And then, of course, someone's, timeline, their own report of their life, readily assessing addictive tendencies and susceptibility to eating disorders, dieting, and that's all been very driven by clinical experience and intuition. But I've maintained a successful and safe practice by not having like a single thing that I do. And I think that makes it easier on providers if you have like your path, your solution. And I've always known that different people need different paths and need different speeds and need different levels of rigidity versus fluidity. People need harm reduction. Some people need really soft messaging. Other people want very distinct guidelines. And so I've been able to tailor my approach by using the time we spend together and someone's food logs, and like more so asking people questions to help them figure out their path rather than being prescriptive about a path. And I think that's where the mental health piece comes in. In a medical setting, someone's looking for protocols, give me my diagnoses and give me my treatment, map it out really well. In a mental health context, it's a little bit more dynamic, more collaborative, and it has probably a longer on-ramp period to figure out what's going to be a good strategy. And so, yeah, in functional medicine, we're very collaborative with the patient to really co-create a plan, modify it, and have it make sense for someone's, not just for their personal goals biologically and psychologically, but also in the context of their lives, their access to resources, their family environment, their levels of stress. And so there's a lot that goes into thinking about what would be helpful for someone, but ultimately the choice is theirs. It's not me making the final decision about someone's health.
Mm. And do you find once people start out working with you that then they obviously things start to change, that then they feel more able to take more responsibility and maybe even learn more and be able to implement more things as they move along?
The people that do the best in my practice are people that are able to like have some regular sessions for, a couple months. That tends to really be a major predictor, obviously. It's probably safe to say that I've made a lot of progress in my work as a provider in the last few years. One of the first major steps I took was creating a mobile app called Wise Mind Nutrition that I have my clients and patients using while they're working with me. And so the app is a chance for people to do a lot of reflective work and to do an assignment and to think about what are their barriers, what are their goals, and to basically create their own plan of guiding principles. It also allows me to see their food if they choose to log, and their reflections at the end of each day. So, probably the first 8 or 9 years of my career was a lot of just counseling and helping people sort through misinformation, throwing some ideas to people. And then when I added the app, people were able to get a lot more nutrition education through the platform and then meet with me to sort through things that they read or encountered along the way, challenges that they faced. And then in the last few years, I've also added a lot more specialty lab testing. And this is the functional medicine part of the work that I do. So if someone is resourced to do some testing, blood, urine, stool, saliva, and I'm in a position to bring all of the results together,
Mm.
we can get a really good treatment plan. So, the ultimate approach would be using the app for food logging and tracking and reflecting, getting counseling services from me either weekly or every other week or at some point monthly, and then investing in some testing so that we could see a lot of the other biological underpinnings. And when I bring all of that together for someone, it's a pretty good combo
Yeah.
to pull levers. And, some people respond rapidly, other people need a lot more time for behavior change. And I just meet people where they're at.
Mm. Would you say there's some specific nutrients that the brain needs in order to function properly? Because we're often told, oh, take this drug and this will sort you out. But I'm sure, as many of my listeners will know, that what we eat, how we eat, when we eat has a big impact on our body and how that functions.
Yeah. One of the things I found early on when I got into nutrition for brain health and nutritional psychiatry was that the early research was mapping out cross-sectional associations between mental health conditions and nutrient deficiencies. And pretty much all of them, if insufficient or deficient have implications for mental health. And the early books that were written on nutrition for mental health kind of walked us through all the different macros and micros. And the concluding chapters in most of them were take a multivitamin, because you need all of them. That's where specialty lab testing comes in, where you could figure out specifically what people need. But the superstars, right, they tend to be minerals like magnesium and zinc, and iron can also be very important. B vitamins are super important for brain health, and there's always discussion about the form of the B vitamin, methylated, etc. And sometimes we do genetic tests to figure out what's needed there. Vitamin D is really important for the entire body, but certainly has strong links with depressive symptoms. And yeah, like I don't want to diminish the role of the other ones. Vitamin C is important in dopamine production. If you look at pathways, you see all these different steps, and vitamins and minerals tend to be cofactors in a lot of converting processes. And so the part that we're kind of still hung up on is like, if we know that this vitamin or this mineral, which are, generally essential vitamins and minerals, are important for this path. If you take a lot of it, does it help that path, right? And we're doing a lot of assuming at this point, right? Like, oh, if you're having issues with dopamine production and you take the cofactors, like, is that going to help? And I think it's probably safe to say that if someone is deficient, it's going to help. But if you just stack on more, it doesn't necessarily, provide additional benefits. The bigger topic that's emerged more recently is not just the role of vitamins and minerals, but the actual environment in the gut, the presence of gut bacteria, and the role of the immune system in communicating with the gut and the brain. And so this goes way beyond single nutrients or macro distributions. This is looking at inflammatory signals that are traveling through the body, possibly even crossing the blood-brain barrier and signaling to the brain. And I think I've focused a lot more on the gut-brain axis as a way of reducing inflammation to help someone's system feel safe, rather than really honing in on single nutrients or just adding a multivitamin. I've worked really hard to help people eat real food from all the different food groups and get a lot of color and a lot of fiber so that a lot of those boxes are checked. But I also know that some people do really well cutting out food groups and really reducing, some of the macros so that you get a major level pulled, for example, low carb and ketogenic approaches.
One of the things that you spoke about at the IFAC conference, because many people will have heard of leaky gut, but you spoke about leaky brain, which I'd never heard of before. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Leaky gut's been around for a few decades, and the official term is intestinal permeability, which describes, a state where things that shouldn't be getting through are getting through. Sometimes people think leaky gut and they think like a piece of rice getting through, but it's really microscopic stuff, bacterial cell walls, etc. The concept of leaky brain got a lot of, permeability at the blood-brain barrier, got some attention in neurodegenerative diseases. If you think about the Alzheimer's, dementia, a lot of research there. But I do think that it's a significant overlooked consideration for a lot of folks that have behavioral issues, impulsivity, a tendency for high-risk behaviors, and a lot of emotional reactivity. There's immune cells at the blood-brain barrier. And so it's not necessarily the same process where you're getting stuff directly leaking through, but you're getting contact at the blood-brain barrier, and the microglia and the astrocytes, some of those immune signaling are picking up on that and sending signals throughout the brain, which is basically saying something's off,
Mm.
right? And that can put the brain in more of a fight or flight response where it's focusing on solving immune related problems rather than being able to have higher executive functioning and really high levels of consciousness. And so
Mhm.
this is the field of psychoneuroimmunology. And there's a lot of emerging research there and a lot of biomarkers. Some of it's familiar and some of it's breakthrough. Some of it's new to me, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I trained as a clinical hypnotherapist all back in 2001, too.
Mm.
And they were talking about psychoneuroimmunology at that point and using hypnotherapy to help as well. So I want to go back to you said about we were speaking about the nutrients and how a lot of it is because people are nutrient deficient. And I guess people in a depressive state where they can't be thinking about food, they're probably just going to grab the nearest thing off the shelf, which is ultra processed. And we know that's very deficient in minerals, it's deficient in protein, it's deficient in fiber, all those things that so there's this catch 22 of people not knowing the effect that the food is having on them, but also then it is having an effect. I
Yeah.
guess that's quite an important issue as well.
Yeah. I mean, if we could address the need for comfort eating, right? The sort of convenience eating that favors a dopamine response over nutrient density, we'd have some major things figured out, right? It does seem that in a depressed or stressed state, the brain is going to favor convenience, dopamine response, and simplicity in terms of chewing and even digesting. And those are the major issues that, we need to provide education about to someone is
Yeah,
that these foods make sense to you and here's reasons why. These other foods might be less rewarding in the short term but probably have some major long-term implications that are worth considering. And yeah, one's ability to trade off the short term for the long term, or I should say, trade off the long term for the short term, in
yeah,
my opinion, is like a major predictor of positive health outcomes and overall good mental health. It shows that the prefrontal cortex is online and they're able to do very sound executive functioning, weighing the pros and cons of different things. And the reality of mental health is that, most people that are struggling lose that part of the brain as a, top order function and are more living in survival based parts of the brain, the, amygdala, etc.
yeah, yeah. They're just fight or flight all the time.
That part.
One of the things, and the other thing that you said, sorry, I keep bringing up things that you said, but it's just so interesting that with a 10% increase in ultra processed foods, you get an 11% increase in depression.
Mm.
And that really highlights the impact that the ultra processed food is having on people. Do you think by the way you're approaching it and the way I'm sure lots of people in the food addiction space in the world that we're in, so like with Jen Unwin and Heidi Gaver and all the other people that are working in this space at the moment, do you think, you know, what impact is that going to have on the food industry? And is there a place for ultra processed food?
Yeah, I think that the shuffling of the deck in the food industry is happening, but it's happening very slow. For example, they in the state of California released a bill recently that said we need to, you know, think about school lunches and reformulate with processing in mind. And the timeline is 5 years, right? So it's like they got till 2028 or 2029 to like make it happen. And so things are happening slowly but surely. The pressure is on. And it's safe to say that nutrition is one factor in declining mental health. And there are many, many others, right? If people are convenience eating, they might also be convenience living. If people have dysfunctional dopamine neurocircuitry, it maybe came from their smartphone use rather than, the food itself. And there's just a lot of other biopsychosocial factors that are involved. And I never want to reduce anything to one cause, but I do think that the children growing up with low fiber, high sugar, ultra processed food primary diets are having significant mental health issues related to that,
Mm,
mood disorders, and what I recently called pre-traumatic stress disorder. It's like that fight or flight state. You haven't, like, nothing major has happened, but it sure feels that way, right?
yeah.
Yeah, all the divide in society and in the world.
Yeah. I've been saying for a number of years that as a lay person, I have no clinical experience in this. I have no research experience in this, but it seemed to me that a lot of the mental health issues that people are going through is because their primary food intake is from ultra processed foods. And that just is what it felt like to me, that just looking around, if people are not getting the right nutrition, how can your brain function? I said to my mum, I'm always having a go at her to eat more protein because what she eats is this minimal amount of protein, and she's not particularly high carb, but she does eat carbs in the form of bread and mozzas and things like that. And it's like, how can your body function if you're not giving it the nutrients it needs? So you need to be thinking about how you do that. But another thing that you spoke about with ultra processed foods is not just about the food, it's about other aspects. So can you talk about that as well?
Yeah, that's one of my areas of interest when I did a pretty deep dive on ultra processed foods and mental health, and I published a paper on that topic. Would be great to link in the show notes. Yeah, I did learn that there isn't just ingredients that we need to think about, but also packaging and the different steps that are involved in the processing of food can introduce a lot of neoformed compounds from the machinery, the high heat. Basically, a big part of ultra processing is high heat exposure, which degrades a lot of nutrients, but also can introduce other compounds, which can be basically just inflammatory.
Mm,
So, a lot of the negative effects of ultra processed food can come from the packaging and the other stuff that isn't, captured and described and isn't well known to the American public or worldwide. And going back to where we started today, it's a perfect example of how the calorie model misses a lot of the bigger picture and the context. If someone's just focusing on calories, but eating this low calorie food that's filled with microplastics, that can't be good.
no, that must affect the endocrine function.
That's right.
I don't like shopping. I don't do the shopping. My husband does it, but he's away at the moment. And I went shopping on Sunday. And as I'm walking around the store, I'm thinking, we have fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, we have meat, but it's all wrapped in plastic, all of
Yeah.
it. And it's like, why? Why is it wrapped in plastic? Because they say we're eating about 5 grams of plastic a week. Why is it wrapped in plastic? But also, we hear a lot around, we've got to save the planet and we've got to do this and we've got to do that sustainable. Then why is it in plastic? Why don't we just drop the plastic and go back to paper bags?
It it's profit maximization for sure. You got to pull the air out of it and seal it, package it. If food is spoiling, it's terrible for the industry and even the grocery markets. And so, yeah, there's a need from the manufacturer side to have food safety and all of that. I've thought about this quite a bit, and I still don't have a really great solution to offer. But there are, for example, co-ops or smaller grocery markets in my area where they have bulk bins, and I've seen people come in with jars to skip the plastic altogether.
Yeah.
So I've seen, at least in Los Angeles, some of the bags that you could put produce in are biodegradable, compostable bags that don't use classic carbon plastic materials. And, there's efforts, but the majority of people are just going to be bombarded with microplastics and nanoparticles,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah. We need to get away from the supermarket model, really.
And we need to work on our body's ability to biotransform, eliminate, and get in the sauna and really focus on ways to excrete, because the environmental exposure is inevitable.
Yeah. And we're bombarded day in, day out all the time.
Mhm.
David, is there anything else before we head towards the end of the podcast? Because I know you've got a hard finish. Is there anything that we haven't spoken about today that you'd really like to mention?
Yeah, I do think it's worth mentioning that I talked about my practice for many years and the mobile app, Wise My Nutrition, the direction that I'm headed, using functional medicine to improve mental health outcomes. It does involve a lot of lab testing, but also the use of AI in order to simultaneously analyze multiple data points.
Mm,
I think a lot of the lab testing companies are integrating AI into the interpretation part, but I've had a lot of success with folks using, I'm a tech person, so I've been able to create my own models and really train AI systems to think in systems biology for mental health. And so I've had a lot of fun in the last few months pulling together standard lab tests with stool tests and putting in people's medications and their supplements and their mental health diagnoses. And AI is able to basically provide blind spots that not even the most savvy physicians or clinicians could really ever come up with on our own. And so I do think that that part of the functional medicine for mental health conversation is cannot be ignored. I know that there's a lot of new software companies that are providing electronic health records that are integrating AI, and I'm on the cutting edge of it and have really enjoyed. And I'm upfront with my patients. I say, I'm going to take all these lab tests from the last 2 years that you have. We're going to do these new 2 tests. I'm going to put in a lot of inputs. We're going to get some insights and some protocols in multiple phases, and we'll go over it together and we'll see what makes sense. I'm obviously savvy, so I can say this doesn't make sense. I don't trust anything blindly. And if the client says, yeah, I've tried that, that worked, or that didn't, we can get some really cool functional medicine protocols by leveraging the technology.
mm, very exciting. I'm just not keen on giving my information to big software companies, I guess.
Sure. And there's a difference between open AI and closed AI. And there's certain, for example, someone like me, I pay a good money for closed AI
Mm,
so that it doesn't get used to train other systems. But we are in a world where you can't trust anything and all of it's used to train everything. I'm pretty sure the Zoom call we're on right now is being used to train models. You know what I'm saying? And
definitely.
so privacy's kind of gone. And someone like myself, that's a clinician, does all the best practices to ensure safety of data. But I think, as you pointed to, even genetic data, it's hard to trust these big tech powers, et cetera. But at some point, you got to accept
Yeah.
and trust.
It's a hard path to walk at the moment, isn't it?
It is.
Because it is exciting, but at the same time, it is scary.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So, how can people find you, get in touch with you? I'm going to ask you to send me that research paper on the food
Sure.
processing, but I put that in the show notes. But how can they find out more about you?
I have 3 websites. drdavidwis.com is my home where I house all my research and podcasts and blogs of professional nature. My mobile app, wisemynutrition.com, has a lot of blogs on nutrition for mental health, and that's where you can download the app on Apple or Google. And then my longstanding group private practice is called Nutrition in Recovery, and that's where people tend to book sessions with me or see the work I've done in the addiction space, I'm also on Instagram, Dr. David Vis, and have Wise Mind Nutrition on TikTok.
How do you spell wise mind?
Wise, not my
Wise,
last
as in
name.
wise. Yeah.
Yeah, it comes from dialectical behavioral therapy. We talk about the wise mind as being a crucial intersection point.
Mm. So before we finish, I'm going to ask you to share your 3 top tips.
3 top tips. I can offer some things. I think that it's important for people to find your own lane and not take on someone else's nutrition or health identity, but find out what resonates with you. And 2 would be run a lot of trial and errors and don't come to any overly firm conclusions because things change over time. An approach that worked really well for me 10 years ago doesn't work as well for me today. And so I like to keep a curious beginner's mind when experimenting with health stuff. And lastly, maybe just lean in and don't do anything that isn't sustainable. Like if things are too difficult, you can back off and you can get more social support, etc. But to think about nutrition and functional medicine as more of a lifetime approach rather than a short-term crises management.
Yeah, definitely. And, for all of us, I think even if you're not in that mind space, we need to really be looking at what can we do that's sustainable. And I'm all for making small changes, because any small change will lead to bigger changes further down if you can compound the effect of it.
That's right.
David, thank you very much for being with me today.
Thanks, Jackie.
I really enjoyed this conversation. It was fascinating to hear David's perspective on how trauma, addiction, depression, and ultra-processed food intersects. I particularly found it interesting that we talked not only about leaky gut, which many people have heard of, but leaky brain, and how immune signaling at the blood-brain barrier may influence mood, behavior, and even our fight or flight response. Another area that isn't spoken about nearly enough is the actual processing of food itself, not just ingredients, but what happens during manufacturing, the high heat, the machinery, the packaging, and how toxins or unwanted compounds can be incorporated into the food along the way. That really adds another layer of conversation beyond calories and macros. I also appreciated David's balanced, thoughtful approach to nutrition and mental health, and his emphasis on collaboration, flexibility, and meeting people where they're at. I think that's how I try to work, is meeting people where they're at. So thank you for listening, and until next time. Disclaimer. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Our guests, whether healthcare professionals or not, are sharing their personal opinions and experiences. This does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making changes to your medications, treatment, or lifestyle, particularly if you're on medication or have concerns about your health.